History remembers him as the Mad King, the man who bankrupted a kingdom to build fairy tale castles in a modern world. This is the paradoxical legacy of King Ludwig II of Bavaria. Yet his death beneath the dark waters of Lake Starnberg remains a cold case that has haunted Europe for over a century. Was it the final act of a diseased mind or a perfect political assassination? To find the answer, we must rewind the clock and unravel the tragedy of history's loneliest monarch. To understand this tragedy, we must first look at the cold nest in which he was born. For Ludwig's flight from reality was a slow, agonizing journey that began long before he ascended the throne. Bavaria in 1845 was a kingdom caught between two worlds, the rising industrial steam of the 19th century and the ancient devout soul of the Catholic South. Ludwig arrived at Nymphenburg Palace into this friction, a birth heralded as a fairy tale but shadowed by profound emotional starvation. His father, King Maximilian II, was a man carved of dry marble, an intellectual disciplinarian who viewed his children as subjects to be drilled rather than souls to be nurtured. His mother, Princess Marie of Prussia, was equally distant, a practical woman with a stunning lack of maternal instinct. The Crown Prince's childhood was a regimen of Spartan cruelty. He was awakened before dawn, forced through endless lessons, and often left physically hungry due to strict dining protocols. At one point, the desperate young prince was even caught trying to steal money just to buy a simple roll of bread. This harsh physical world became a prison, but Ludwig found a key to unlock a different door, his own imagination. While his tutors tried to force him into the mold of a Prussian bureaucrat with military drills and mathematics, Ludwig retreated into a sanctuary of theatrical fantasy, dressing as a nun or reciting tragic poetry. The true catalyst for his future obsession, however, was the royal summer residence of Neuschwanstein. Here, surrounded by the Alps and murals of German legends, Ludwig discovered the story of Lohengrin, the Swan Knight. He saw in this solitary noble figure a spiritual twin, realizing for the first time that art and architecture were not mere decorations, but alternative realities where he could be safe. He spent hours staring at the walls, feeding the swans in the lake, and deciding that if the real world would not offer him a place, he would build one that did. By his teenage years, the contrast between his internal dreams and external duties had become agonizing. He grew into a breathtakingly handsome young man standing 6'4" with deep, melancholic blue eyes. Yet he was socially crippled by shyness and terrified of being looked at. His father, seeing only a problem child living in a fog, even considered bypassing him in the line of succession in favor of his younger brother, Otto. But destiny had a different script. In March 1864, King Maximilian II died suddenly of a chest infection. The heavy doors of the Munich residence were thrown open, and the seasoned courtiers bowed low not to a prepared statesman, but to a trembling, pale 18-year-old boy who had never seen a state paper in his life. In a heartbeat, the terrified dreamer was the absolute ruler of Bavaria. The transformation was immediate and intoxicating. Overnight, the problem child became the most powerful man in the kingdom. The strict tutors vanished. The curfew was gone. The meager allowance was replaced by the entire treasury of the state. For Ludwig, it must have felt like stepping out of a dark dungeon into the blinding noon sun. And the people of Munich went wild for him. When he rode behind his father's hearse, and later at his accession ceremonies, the crowds were stunned by his beauty. He looked like a Greek god, or better yet, like the very swan knight he idolized. Women swooned, men cheered. They projected all their hopes onto him. They saw a new era of youth, beauty, and art. They didn't see the fear in his eyes, or the total lack of political instinct. They didn't know that the young king found the cheering crowds overwhelming, that the noise hurt his head, that he wished he could just vanish back to the mountains. But Ludwig tried. In those first few weeks, he attended the cabinet meetings. He sat at the head of the table looking magnificent in his uniform, trying to listen to the drone of old ministers talking about taxes and treaties. But his mind was already drifting. He realized very quickly that being king wasn't about being Lohengrin. It was about paperwork. It was boring. It was tedious. And Ludwig II had a fatal intolerance for boredom. He had the power now to make the world interesting, and he intended to use it. While the ministers were discussing the looming threat of Otto von Bismarck in Prussia, Ludwig was secretly dispatching a royal secretary on a mission that had nothing to do with politics. He gave the man a ruby ring and a photograph and told him to go to Vienna or Switzerland or wherever he had to go and find a man who was currently on the run from the law. That man was Richard Wagner. At this point in history, Richard Wagner was 51 years old and a disaster. He was a musical genius, certainly, but he was also a political revolutionary who had been exiled from Germany for his role in the uprisings of 1848. He was drowning in debt, chased by creditors across half of Europe, hiding in hotels under false names, and contemplating suicide. He had written The Ring Cycle, the greatest musical work of the century, but he couldn't get it staged. He had lost hope. He had just published the text of The Ring with a preface asking if there was any German prince worth his salt who would support true art. He thought he was shouting into the void. He didn't know that the 18-year-old king of Bavaria had read that preface and taken it as a personal command from the universe. When Ludwig's secretary finally tracked Wagner down in Stuttgart, the composer was terrified. He thought he was being arrested for his debts. Instead, he was handed a ring and a letter from the King of Bavaria. The letter was an outpouring of teenage adoration. Ludwig promised to pay all of Wagner's debts, to give him a villa, to stage his operas, to be his protector forever. Wagner couldn't believe his luck. He was being saved by a deus ex machina. He immediately traveled to Munich. The first meeting between Ludwig II and Richard Wagner on May 4th, 1864 in the Munich residence was charged with an intensity that is hard to describe in modern terms. It wasn't just a meeting between a patron and an artist. It was a collision of souls. Ludwig stood there trembling, looking at the man who had created the world he wanted to live in. Wagner looked at the king and saw a savior, a beautiful, pliable vessel that he could fill with his own ideas. They spoke for hours. Ludwig was weeping. Wagner was weeping. In a letter to a friend the next day, Wagner wrote, "He loves me with the ardor and depth of a first love. He knows and divines everything I feel and want." Ludwig wrote to Wagner, "You are the star that shines upon my life. I will remain true to you until death." The cabinet and the court watched this unfold with absolute horror. They had hoped the young king would marry a nice princess, produce an heir, and sign the papers they put in front of him. Instead, he was spending every waking hour with a known revolutionary, a man with a scandalous reputation, a man who was old enough to be his father. They saw Wagner as a leech, sucking the treasury dry and poisoning the king's mind with radical ideas. And to an extent, they were right. Wagner was demanding. He wanted a new theater. He wanted a massive salary. He wanted control, and Ludwig gave him everything. For a few brief, shining months in 1864 and 1865, Ludwig was happy. For the first time in his life, he wasn't lonely. He had a friend, a mentor, a father figure, who didn't judge him but celebrated his eccentricities. They planned a great festival theater in Munich that would rival anything in the world. They talked about the redemption of the German spirit through art. Ludwig felt that he was finally doing what a king was supposed to do. He was becoming a patron of the sublime. He didn't care about the grumbling of the ministers or the nasty articles appearing in the Munich press, which Wagner's enemies were funding. He was living in the clouds, but the ground was trembling. The citizens of Munich, initially charmed by their handsome king, were getting jealous. They didn't like this foreigner, Wagner, this Saxon with his expensive tastes, whispering in their king's ear. Rumors began to circulate, nasty rumors about the nature of the relationship between the king and the composer. While there is no evidence their relationship was sexual, it was intensely, uncomfortably intimate. The king was spending tens of thousands of gulden on Wagner, while the state budget was tight. The tension in the capital was building. The conservative ministers saw an opportunity. They began to draft an ultimatum. They would force the king to choose. It was either the crown or the composer. Ludwig was still floating on the high of his artistic dream, completely unaware that his first great political crisis was about to smash into him. He thought love and art could conquer reality. He was 18 years old. He was the king by the grace of God, and he believed he was untouchable. He was about to learn the first brutal lesson of his reign, that in the 19th century, even a king cannot ignore the mob, and that the price of dreaming is often paid in betrayal. The shadows were gathering around the throne, and the boy who loved swans was about to find out that the world of men has very sharp teeth. The winter of 1865 descended upon Munich with a biting cold that seemed to seep through the stone walls of the residence, chilling the very marrow of the young king. The atmosphere inside the palace was even more frigid than the snow-swept streets outside. The battle lines had been drawn, not on a field of war, but across the polished mahogany of the cabinet table. On one side stood the 20-year-old Ludwig, clutching his dream of a kingdom redeemed by art. On the other stood his entire government, the conservative press, the terrified citizens of Munich, and the extended Wittelsbach family. They all demanded one thing: the head of the sorcerer, Richard Wagner. The situation had become untenable. The press was running vicious cartoons depicting Wagner as a greedy beggar draining the royal treasury, or worse, as a puppet master pulling the strings of a mesmerized, childlike king. The prime minister, Ludwig von der Pforten, a man of steel-rimmed spectacles and unyielding pragmatism, finally delivered the ultimatum that would shatter Ludwig's youth. He told the king, with a bluntness that bordered on treason, that he had to choose. He could have the love and companionship of his musical idol, or he could have the love and loyalty of his people. He could not have both. If Wagner stayed, the cabinet would resign en masse, the people might revolt, and the throne itself, the very source of the power Ludwig used to protect Wagner, would be in jeopardy. Ludwig fought back with the desperate fury of a trapped animal. He raged, he wept, he threatened to abdicate and run away to Switzerland with Wagner to live in a mountain hut. But the iron logic of the state was a wall he could not break. He was the king, and a king belongs to the nation, not to himself. In the early hours of a December morning, pale and shaking, Ludwig signed the order of banishment. It was his first true act of governance, and it broke his heart. On December 10th, 1865, under the cover of darkness to avoid the jeering crowds, Richard Wagner boarded a train for Switzerland. Ludwig did not go to the station to say goodbye. He couldn't bear the finality of it. Instead, he retreated into a deep, black depression. He felt he had betrayed the only person who understood him. He wrote to Wagner, "I feel as though I am in my grave. My love for you is eternal." But the physical separation had occurred. The king had saved his throne, but he had lost his soul's companion. This moment taught Ludwig a dangerous lesson. Reality is cruel, power is a cage, and the only way to survive is to deceive the world while living a secret life within. The year that followed, 1866, brought no relief. In fact, it brought the very thing Ludwig feared most: war. The German-speaking lands were fracturing. For centuries, the loose confederation of German states had been dominated by Austria, the Catholic, traditional imperial power in the south. But now, the hungry wolf of Prussia was rising in the north, led by King Wilhelm I and his terrifying chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was a man who believed that the great questions of the time would be resolved not by speeches and majority decisions, but by blood and iron. He wanted to unify Germany under Prussian rule, and that meant kicking Austria out. Bavaria, as the largest German state after the two powers, was caught directly in the middle. Ludwig detested militarism. The very idea of shooting cannons, of marching armies, of blood spilled in muddy fields was physically repulsive to him. He saw it as a grotesque waste of life and a disruption of the aesthetic harmony he craved. When the war clouds gathered, Ludwig didn't ride out to inspect his troops or huddle with his generals over maps. He disappeared while the Bavarian army was mobilizing to fight alongside Austria against the Prussian machine. Their commander-in-chief was hiding on Roseninsel, the Rose Island, in the middle of Lake Starnberg. It was a surreal juxtaposition. Europe was holding its breath for a clash of titans, and the King of Bavaria was rowing a boat in the moonlight, surrounded by thousands of blooming roses, reciting poetry to his aide-de-camp, Prince Paul of Thurn and taxis. Prince Paul was handsome, artistic, and for a time he filled the emotional void left by Wagner. They dressed up as characters from operas. They watched fireworks reflect off the dark water. The ministers in Munich were frantic. They sent messengers to the island begging the king to return to the capital, to show himself to the troops, to sign urgent mobilization papers. Ludwig often refused to see them. He felt that the war was a nuisance, a stupid interruption of his real work, which was contemplating the beautiful. This behavior was not just eccentricity. To the Prussians and the serious men of Europe, it looked like dereliction of duty. It looked like madness. The 7 Weeks' War was a disaster for Bavaria. The Prussian army was a modern, efficient killing machine equipped with a new needle gun, a breech-loading rifle that could fire 5 times faster than the muzzle loaders used by the Austrians and Bavarians. The war was over almost before it began. In July 1866, the Bavarian army was smashed. Ludwig was forced to confront the wreckage. The peace terms were humiliating. Bavaria had to pay a crippling indemnity of 30 million gulden to Prussia, money Ludwig would rather have spent on 10 operas. They had to cede territory, but the true poison pill was a secret treaty. Bismarck, the master chess player, forced Ludwig to sign a Schutz- und Trutzbündnis, a defensive and offensive alliance. It stated that in the event of a future war, specifically against France, the Bavarian army would come under the direct command of the King of Prussia. With the stroke of a pen, Ludwig II ceased to be a sovereign monarch in matters of war and peace. He was now, effectively, a vassal of Berlin. The psychological impact of this defeat on Ludwig cannot be overstated. He had been raised on the stories of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the absolute ruler. Now, at 21, he was a puppet. His sovereignty was a sham. He felt the humiliation in his bones. He told his few confidants that he was merely a shadow king. If he couldn't have real power in the real world, if he couldn't stop the Prussians from dictating his foreign policy, then he would turn his back on that world entirely. He would build a kingdom where his will was still law, where Prussia didn't exist, where he was the undisputed master. It was in the ashes of the 1866 defeat that the true building rage began to simmer. But before he could fully retreat into stone, there was one last trap the world had set for him: the expectation of marriage. The pressure to produce an heir is the primary duty of any hereditary monarch, and the whispers in the court were getting louder. The king needs a wife, they said. The king needs to settle down. They hoped a woman would cure him of his moods, his nocturnal habits, and his intense, suspicious friendships with handsome men like Prince Paul. Ludwig felt the walls closing in. He looked around the royal courts of Europe and saw only strangers. But there was one woman he truly loved, though not in the way the world understood. Her name was Duchess Elizabeth in Bavaria, known to history as Sisi. She was his cousin, and she was the Empress of Austria. Sisi was in many ways the female version of Ludwig. She was breathtakingly beautiful, obsessed with her own image, deeply melancholic, terrified of crowds, and hated court protocol. They called each other eagle and dove. They understood each other's desire to fly away. But Sisi was already married to the Emperor of Austria. So she did the next best thing. She pushed Ludwig toward her younger sister, Duchess Sophie Charlotte. Sophie Charlotte was a nice girl. She was pretty, musical, and she had a pleasant singing voice. To Ludwig, she had one supreme qualification. She knew Wagner's music. In his desperate attempt to convince himself that he could be a normal man, Ludwig projected his fantasies onto Sophie. He didn't see her as a flesh-and-blood woman. He saw her as Elsa, the heroine from Wagner's Lohengrin. He convinced himself that he could marry Elsa. In January 1867, the engagement was announced. The kingdom breathed a sigh of relief. Pope Pius IX sent his blessing. Commemorative coins were minted with the profiles of Ludwig and Sophie. The date was set, but almost immediately the cracks began to show. Ludwig's behavior during the engagement was bizarre, to say the least. He would visit Sophie at her parents' palace, but instead of courting her, he would often bring Prince Paul along, and the three of them would sit and read aloud. Or he would arrive in the middle of the night, wake the household, talk at her for an hour about the spiritual meaning of Wagner's operas, and then leave. He avoided physical contact. There were no stolen kisses, no passionate embraces. He kissed her on the forehead, like a brother. In his letters to her, he wrote passionately about their spiritual union, about how they would sit on the throne together, like characters in a legend. But whenever the conversation turned to the wedding date, he panicked. Inside his private diaries, a war was raging. This is the period where we see the most tortured evidence of his homosexuality. He wrote of his struggle against the flesh, his desire to be pure for Sophie, and his repeated failures to suppress his attraction to men. He viewed his sexual desires as a curse, a test from God that he was failing. The idea of the wedding night, of the physical act required to produce an heir with a woman, filled him with a revulsion he couldn't articulate. As the wedding date of August 25th approached, Ludwig began to disintegrate. He claimed he was ill. He delayed the date to October. The preparations continued. The wedding coach was built, a magnificent gilded carriage that cost a fortune. The wedding dress was sewn. The invitations were sent to the crowned heads of Europe. Sophie Charlotte was not stupid. She sensed that something was wrong. She wrote to him asking why he seemed so distant, why he fled from her presence. Ludwig felt suffocated. He felt like he was walking to the gallows. He felt that marriage would be the final nail in the coffin of his freedom, turning him into a domestic bourgeois husband, forcing him to attend balls and dinners for the rest of his life. Finally, in October 1867, just days before the rescheduled ceremony, Ludwig snapped. He couldn't do it. He wrote a letter to Sophie's father, Duke Max, breaking off the engagement. The scandal was nuclear. It was an insult to the ducal house, an insult to the Empress of Austria, a shock to the nation. But when Ludwig sent the letter, his reaction wasn't shame. It was euphoria. He wrote in his diary, "Sophie is written off. The gloomy picture fades. I long for freedom. I thirsted for freedom. Now I have it. I am resurrected." Legend says that when he received the confirmation that the engagement was officially dissolved, he took the marble bust of Sophie that stood in his study and threw it out the window into the courtyard, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. Whether or not the bust actually flew, the symbolism was clear. Ludwig had thrown away the last chance for a normal life. He had rejected the role of husband and father. He had rejected the political reality of his era. He was 22 years old and he was done with the world of people. Now, he turned his eyes to the mountains. If he could not be the powerful king of Bavaria, and if he could not be a husband, he would be a builder. In the spring of 1867, he had visited the Wartburg Castle in Thuringia, the place where Martin Luther had translated the Bible, and more importantly to Ludwig, the setting of Wagner's Tannhäuser. He was mesmerized by the medieval architecture, the great hall, the sense of a fortress against time. He also visited France and saw the Pierrefonds Castle, a medieval ruin that was being imaginatively restored by Napoleon III. A vision began to form in his mind. He wanted a Wartburg of his own. He wanted a castle that grew out of the rock, high above the squabbles of the ministers and the noise of the cities. He pulled out the old maps of his childhood of the ruins of 2 small robber baron castles near Hohenschwangau, Vorder Hohenschwangau, and Hinter Hohenschwangau. They were just piles of rubble on a jagged ridge, often covered in mist. But in Ludwig's mind, he saw something else. He didn't hire an architect to draw the initial sketches. He hired a theatrical set designer, Christian Jank. That is a crucial detail. Neuschwanstein was literally designed as a stage set before it was engineered as a building. He wrote to Wagner, who was now living in Switzerland with his mistress and later wife, Cosima. "It is my intention to rebuild the old castle ruin in the authentic style of the old German knights' castles. The location is one of the most beautiful to be found, holy and unapproachable." Holy and unapproachable. That was the goal. The year 1868 marked the turning point. The king, who had tried to govern, tried to wage war, and tried to love a woman, finally gave up on all of it. He began to withdraw from Munich. He communicated with his ministers increasingly through letters and intermediaries. He started to sleep during the day and wake at sunset. The first stones of the new castle, later Neuschwanstein, were laid. But it wasn't just one castle. His mind was racing with projects. He wanted a Versailles. He wanted a Byzantine palace. He wanted a Chinese summer house. The building rage had taken hold. It was a drug more potent than alcohol, a way to externalize the fantasy that was eating him alive. As the 1860s bled into the 1870s, the world was changing fast. Prussia was preparing for its final war against France to cement the German Empire. Industrialization was roaring. Socialists were organizing. But in the Bavarian Alps, the hammers were ringing against stone, not to build factories, but to build a portal to the Middle Ages. Ludwig was constructing his cocoon. He was about to embark on the most expensive, beautiful, and lonely journey in royal history. The dream was solidifying into marble and gold, and he was ready to lock the door from the inside. By the summer of 1870, the fragile peace that Ludwig had tried to maintain in his mountain retreat was shattered by the thunder of cannons. The Franco-Prussian War had arrived, the conflict that would finally forge the German Empire in blood and iron. For Ludwig II, this war was a personal nightmare of Shakespearean proportions. He was a German king, bound by blood and treaty to the German cause. Yet his soul belonged to France. He worshipped the French Bourbons. He idolized Louis XIV. He spoke French fluently and dreamed of the glittering courts of Versailles. Now, the cruel machinery of politics demanded that he send his Bavarian peasants to kill the very people he admired most. When the mobilization orders came, Ludwig fell into a state of profound agitation. He felt physically ill at the thought of the slaughter. He considered abdication again, talking wildly of leaving the throne to his brother Otto and fleeing to a remote island in the Aegean Sea. But the trap was shut tight. The treaty he had been forced to sign in 1866 left him no choice. If he refused to mobilize, Prussia would occupy Bavaria, and the Wittelsbach dynasty would be erased from history. With a trembling hand, he signed the mobilization order. While the Bavarian troops marched west to die in the mud of Sedan and Paris, their king retreated further into the mist. He did not visit the front. He did not visit the wounded in the hospitals. To the patriotic citizens of Munich, swept up in a wave of pan-German nationalism, their king's absence was a scandal. They wanted a warrior. They got a ghost. Ludwig locked himself away in his hunting lodges, trying to drown out the news of the war with the music of Wagner and the blueprints of his castles. But the war had one final, crushing humiliation in store for him. In late 1870, as the French armies collapsed, Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Prussia, decided it was time to close the deal. He wanted to proclaim King Wilhelm of Prussia as the German emperor. But for this new empire to look legitimate, the offer of the imperial crown couldn't come from the people or a parliament. That would be too democratic. It had to come from the fellow German princes, and specifically, it had to come from the monarch of the largest, most independent state, Bavaria. Bismarck needed Ludwig II to write a letter formally inviting Wilhelm to become emperor. This letter, known to history as the Kaiserbrief, was the price of Bavaria's soul. Ludwig found the idea repulsive. To invite the Prussian king to become his overlord was to voluntarily sign his own death warrant as a sovereign monarch. He would be demoted from a king to a glorified governor. He refused. Bismarck, however, knew exactly where Ludwig was weak. He didn't threaten him with guns. He tempted him with gold. Bismarck knew about the castles. He knew the king was hemorrhaging money on his building projects. So he sent a secret emissary, Count Holstein, a man Ludwig trusted but who was essentially a Prussian agent, to the king's retreat at Hohenschwangau. The scene that played out in the snowy castle was a moment of pure Faustian bargaining. Hohenstein laid it out. If Ludwig signed the letter, Bismarck would guarantee a massive secret annual payment to the king from the Welfenfonds, a slush fund of confiscated money. Millions of marks untraceable delivered directly to the king's privy purse. Enough to build Neuschwanstein, enough to build Herrenchiemsee. Ludwig was cornered. He was suffering from a terrible toothache, his head was pounding, and he was financially desperate. In a moment of weakness and resignation, he took the pen. He copied the draft that Bismarck had written. He signed the Kaiserbrief. With that signature, he sold the independence of Bavaria for the funds to build his dream world. It was a transaction that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He felt dirty. He felt like a traitor to his ancestors. On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the very palace Ludwig worshipped, the German Empire was proclaimed. King Wilhelm of Prussia became Kaiser Wilhelm I. Ludwig refused to attend. He stayed in Bavaria, claiming he was too ill to travel. Instead, he sent his brother, Prince Otto. The description Otto brought back confirmed Ludwig's worst fears. Otto, who was already showing signs of the mental instability that would later destroy him, was horrified by the ceremony. He described it to Ludwig as cold, empty, ostentatious, and heartless. He told his brother that the Wittelsbachs looked like mere serfs following the Prussian chariot. Ludwig listened in silence. The reality of the new Germany was too ugly to bear. From that day forward, Ludwig decided that if he could not be a true king in the real world, a world now dominated by Prussian generals and factory smoke, he would build an alternative kingdom where his sovereignty was absolute. The building rage was no longer just a hobby. It was a psychological survival strategy. The 1870s became the decade of the stone cocoons. Ludwig began to build with a manic, feverish intensity. The first of his great projects to near completion was Linderhof. Situated in a lonely valley in the Graswangtal, it was not a massive palace but a royal villa, a jewel box. It was a tribute to the French Rococo, to the age of Louis XV and Madame de Pompadour. Every inch of it was covered in gold, velvet, and porcelain. But the most revealing feature of Linderhof was the dining room. Ludwig commissioned a technological marvel, the Tischlein Deck Dish, the wishing table. It was a dining table set on a mechanical elevator. It would be set with food in the kitchen downstairs, then hoisted up through the floor into the dining room. This allowed Ludwig to eat entirely alone without even a servant in the room to witness him. He would dine on 12 courses, conversing with imaginary guests, Louis XIV, Marie Antoinette, Madame de Maintenon. He would raise his glass to the empty chairs. The servants, listening at the door, would hear the king talking and laughing, holding court with ghosts. It was the behavior of a man who found the company of the dead vastly preferable to the living. But Linderhof was just the foyer to his fantasy. Higher up in the mountains, Neuschwanstein was rising. It was an engineering nightmare. The castle was perched on a knife-edge ridge. Roads had to be blasted out of the rock. Water had to be piped from a spring hundreds of meters away. Ludwig drove his architects, Eduard Riedel and Georg von Dolman, to the brink of insanity. He demanded deadlines that were physically impossible. He changed the plans constantly. He wanted the castle to be a literal representation of Wagner's operas. The Singers' Hall was designed for Tannhäuser, the bedroom for Tristan and Isolde. He covered the walls with murals of legends, but this wasn't just a medieval fortress. It was a high-tech bunker. Behind the tapestries and the wood paneling, Neuschwanstein was equipped with the latest technology: central air heating, running warm water, automatic flushing toilets, and an electric bell system for the servants. Ludwig wanted the illusion of the Middle Ages, but the comforts of the 19th century. He was creating a hermetically sealed environment where time did not exist. Then there was the most ambitious and ruinous project of all, Herrenchiemsee. Ludwig bought the island of Herreninsel in Bavaria's largest lake, the Chiemsee, and set out to build a full-scale replica of Versailles. This was his Temple of Fame to Louis XIV. It was a project of staggering scale. The Hall of Mirrors at Herrenchiemsee is actually longer than the original in France. The amount of gold leaf used was astronomical. But unlike Versailles, which was built to house a court of thousands, Herrenchiemsee was built for one man. It was a palace of silence. Ludwig only spent a total of 10 days there in his entire life. He would wander through the endless empty staterooms at night, his footsteps echoing on the parquet floors, a solitary figure reflected in thousands of mirrors. He was the absolute monarch of an empty kingdom. As the buildings rose, the man deteriorated. The golden youth of 1864 was vanishing. Ludwig began to gain weight rapidly, his tall frame becoming heavy and bloated. He developed a severe addiction to sweets, and his teeth, which had always been poor, began to rot and fall out. The pain was constant, leading him to take large amounts of chloral hydrate and other sedatives to sleep, and copious amounts of strong tea and cognac to wake up. He became deeply ashamed of his appearance. He refused to be photographed. He refused to see his ministers. When he had to meet people, he would often hide his mouth behind a handkerchief or mumble to hide his ruined teeth. His schedule inverted completely. He rose at 6 p.m. and went to bed at 6 a.m. The night was his domain. This is when the legend of the Moon King truly took hold. He would embark on his famous sleigh rides. He had elaborate sleighs built, gilded and carved with swans and cherubs, lined with ermine and blue velvet. He would thunder through the snowy valleys of the Alps in the dead of night, the horses' hooves muffled by the snow, the only sound the jingling of the bells. Sometimes he would have outriders carrying electric torches, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the pine trees. To the woodcutters and peasants who saw him fly past, he was a terrifying and magical sight. They would kneel in the snow and take off their caps. Ludwig felt safe in the dark. The darkness hid his decaying body. It hid the modern world. It allowed him to be the Lohengrin of his dreams. His isolation took on even more eccentric forms. He began to demand separate Vorstellungen, private performances at the court theater in Munich. He would command the entire opera company or theater troupe to perform a full play or opera, with full sets, costumes, and orchestra, for an audience of exactly one person, himself. He would sit alone in the royal box, in the center of the vast dark auditorium. He did this because he could not bear the deadly opera glasses of the audience staring at him. He wanted to lose himself in the illusion on stage without the distraction of reality. The cost was enormous. The singers hated it. Singing to a dark, empty void is unnerving, but the king paid, and the king commanded. Sometimes, if a singer gestured too much or broke the illusion, Ludwig would hiss from the darkness. He was the ultimate director of his own reality. But the most surreal addition to his dream world was the Venus Grotto at Linderhof. Ludwig wanted to recreate the scene from Wagner's Tannhäuser, where the knight resides in the Venusberg. He ordered an artificial cave to be built. It was a marvel of engineering, a steel framework covered in canvas and cement to look like rock. Inside there was an underground lake, a waterfall, and a painted backdrop of the Germanic heavens. He installed the first electricity generating plant in Bavaria just to light this cave. He had dynamic lighting effects, red, blue, and pink lights that could change the mood. He had a golden shellboat made in which he would be rowed around the tiny artificial lake by a servant while a wave machine rippled the water. He would sit there for hours feeding the swans, listening to music totally cut off from the sun and the earth. It was a womb of artificiality. Yet even in the Venus Grotto the real world intruded. The blue light technology was finicky and often failed. The wave machine was noisy. The paint on the walls would peel due to the dampness. Ludwig was constantly frustrated that reality couldn't match the perfection of his imagination. He wrote, "I want to remain an eternal enigma to myself and to others." But the enigma was becoming expensive. By the mid-1870s, the financial cracks were beginning to show. The Guelph Fund from Bismarck, the blood money, was flowing, but it wasn't enough. Ludwig was spending faster than he could steal. He began to borrow from private banks. He borrowed from the royal family's private fortune. He borrowed against his future civil list allowance. His debt was mounting into the millions. The ministers in Munich were watching with growing alarm. They weren't just worried about the money, they were worried about the king's sanity. The reports from the servants were filtering back to the capital. The king bowing to statues, the king talking to invisible people, the king flying into rages if his soup was cold, ordering servants to be flogged, orders that his loyal staff quietly ignored. And there was the matter of his brother, Otto. In 1872, Prince Otto, the one who had seen the horrors of the Franco-Prussian War and the humiliation of Versailles, finally broke. He was found in the Munich residence, screaming, smashing furniture, and declaring that he was not Otto, but a sinner damned by God. The doctors were called. The diagnosis was dementia praecox, schizophrenia. Otto was locked away in Nymphenburg and later Fürstenried Palace. Ludwig was devastated. He saw in Otto's madness a terrifying reflection of his own potential fate. He visited his brother initially, but the sight of the raving, unkempt man who used to be his cheerful companion was too much. He stopped visiting. He retreated further. He feared that the Wittelsbach curse was coming for him next. But Ludwig wasn't mad in the way Otto was. Ludwig was lucid. He could still discuss literature, history, and architecture with brilliance. His tragedy was that he refused to compromise. He was building a dam against the 19th century, stone by stone. But the water was rising. The loans were coming due. The ministers were whispering. And in Berlin, Bismarck was watching, perhaps wondering if the useful idiot in Bavaria had finally outlived his usefulness. The stage was set for the final act, but Ludwig, lost in the blue light of his artificial cave, didn't hear the footsteps approaching the door. He was too busy dreaming of a castle that would be even grander, even higher, even more impossible than the rest. A castle that would be a sanctuary where he could finally be safe. He didn't know that he was actually building his own prison. By the dawn of the 1880s, the King of Bavaria had effectively ceased to inhabit the same temporal plane as his subjects. The sun that rose over Munich, waking the shopkeepers, the soldiers, and the ministers to their daily toil, was the signal for Ludwig II to draw the heavy velvet curtains and retreat into the oblivion of sleep. His day began when the moon rose. This inversion was not merely a habit. It was a rejection of the mundane world and its blinding, unforgiving light. In the darkness, the aging, overweight, and toothless man could still pretend to be the eternal youth, the swan knight, the absolute monarch. But the darkness also hid a growing paranoia and a desperation that was slowly turning his fairy tale existence into a Gothic horror story. The Night Kingdom was no longer a poetic metaphor. It was a physical reality, a hermetically sealed bubble of artificial light and silence that was drifting further and further away from the rocky shores of sanity. The isolation of the king created a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Since Ludwig refused to interact with his aristocratic peers or his political ministers, many found dry, boring, and deceitful, he began to fill his world with a different kind of companion. He turned to the only people he saw, his servants, his soldiers, and his stable boys. This was the era of the favorites, a time that scandalized the rigid class structure of 19th century Germany. The king would dine with his master of the horse, Richard Hornig, or his quartermaster, Karl Hesselschwert. He would shower them with expensive gifts, dictate long, passionate letters to them, and treat them as his spiritual equals. To the outside world, this looked like a grotesque dereliction of dignity. To the cabinet ministers, it looked like a security risk. They feared these uneducated men were influencing state policy, whispering poison into the king's ear. But the truth revealed in Ludwig's heartbreakingly candid secret diaries was far more tortured. These relationships were the only emotional lifelines he had, yet they were fraught with immense guilt. Ludwig remained a devout Catholic, terrified of hellfire, and he viewed his attraction to men as a spiritual sickness. His diaries from this period are painful to read. They are a litany of oaths and vows to refrain from physical intimacy, to remain pure, followed inevitably by entries recording his falls and defeats. He would swear on the crucifix, on the memory of Louis XIV, on the Holy Grail, that he would conquer his nature, only to fail again and again. He punished himself with emotional scourging, retreating further into his shell. He wanted a Parsifal, a pure fool, who could share his aesthetic vision without the complications of human desire. But he was a man of flesh and blood, trapped in a cycle of longing and shame. As the king withdrew socially, his need to assert control over his environment manifested in the only way he knew how, through architecture and ritual. The building rage had now metastasized into a financial cancer. Neuschwanstein was rising, a limestone spike against the sky, but inside it was a lonely place. The great singers' hall, designed for Wagnerian festivals with hundreds of guests, echoed only with the king's footsteps. He never heard a single concert there. It was a stage set for a play that would never open. But his obsession had shifted. He was now consumed by the Bavarian Versailles at Herrenchiemsee. The expense of Herrenchiemsee was staggering. It wasn't just the stone and the gold leaf. It was the cost of operating a palace that was never used. On the rare nights Ludwig stayed there, he would order the Hall of Mirrors to be fully lit. This required over 2,000 candles to be lit simultaneously. The heat was intense. The wax dripped onto the parquet floors. The light was blindingly brilliant, turning the hall into a corridor of liquid fire. Ludwig would walk through it alone, catching his reflection in the infinite regression of the mirrors, a solitary figure in a sea of light. Then, after an hour or so, he would signal, and the candles would be extinguished. Thousands of marks burned for a moment of illusion. It was magnificent, and it was madness. To fund these moments, Ludwig was destroying the financial stability of the House of Wittelsbach. He had long since exhausted his civil list, his state salary, and the secret subsidies from Bismarck. He began to borrow frantically. He took loans from every bank that would talk to him. When the Bavarian banks closed their doors, he sent his servants across Europe to find money. He tried to borrow from the Rothschilds, from the French Orléans family, even sending emissaries to the Shah of Persia and the Sultan of Turkey, offering vague political favors in exchange for cash. These missions were amateurish and humiliating. The European courts began to whisper that the King of Bavaria was practically a beggar. In Munich, the government was watching with cold reptilian eyes. The Prime Minister Johann von Lutz was the antithesis of Ludwig. Lutz was a pragmatist, a bureaucrat, a man of laws and ledgers. He had served Ludwig for years, often shielding the king from the worst consequences of his neglect. But by 1885, Lutz had come to a conclusion. The king was a liability. The government had established a cabinet noir, a black chamber that intercepted the king's mail. They knew about his debts. They knew about his desperate pleas to foreign potentates. They knew about his intimate relationships with troopers. They were gathering a dossier, not to help him, but to destroy him when the time was right. The crisis point arrived not with a bang, but with a banker's letter. By 1885, Ludwig was 14 million marks in debt. The interest payments alone were devouring his income. The creditors, realizing that the king had no way to pay, threatened to seize his assets. Imagine the scandal, the king's castles, the symbols of the state, being repossessed by foreign banks, Construction on Neuschwanstein stopped because the stonemasons hadn't been paid. They threatened to sue the king. For Lutz and the cabinet, this was the red line. A bankrupt king was vulnerable to blackmail. If Ludwig sold Bavarian state secrets or territory to get money, the German Empire itself would be threatened. Bismarck in Berlin was losing patience. He had tolerated the eccentricities, but he would not tolerate financial collapse. Ludwig, trapped in his mountain eyrie, refused to see the precipice. When his finance minister told him there was no more money, Ludwig simply ordered him to find more. He suggested selling off state lands or taxing the people more heavily or simply printing money. When the ministers refused, citing the Constitution, Ludwig flew into a rage. He threatened to dismiss the entire cabinet. He threatened to abolish the parliament. He spoke of restoring absolute monarchy. These were the rantings of a man cornered, but to the ministers, they sounded like treason. Ludwig was becoming dangerous. The final winter of 1885 to 1886 was a bleak season of entrapment. Ludwig spent most of it at Neuschwanstein, which was still covered in scaffolding. The heating system often malfunctioned. The king sat in his high tower, wrapped in furs, reading books about the despotic sultans of the East, dreaming of a world where a king could simply behead those who disobeyed him. He began to make wild plans. He talked of founding a new kingdom in the Canary Islands or South America, a place where he could rule without a constitution. He sent servants to scout locations. It was a delusion, a frantic mental escape hatch. Down in Munich, the trap was being sprung. Prime Minister Lutz met with the king's uncle, Prince Luitpold. Luitpold was 70 years old, a respectable, quiet man who had spent his life in the shadow of his brilliant but unstable nephews. Lutz presented the case. The king is bankrupt. The king is neglecting his duties. The king is likely insane. If we do not act, the banks will seize the palaces, the scandal will destroy the monarchy, and Prussia might intervene to abolish Bavarian independence entirely. To save the throne, the king must be sacrificed. Luitpold hesitated. To depose a divinely anointed king was a grave sin and a political earthquake. But Lutz had the weapon ready: psychiatry. They didn't need to put Ludwig on trial for treason. That would be too public, too messy. They simply needed to declare him medically unfit. It was a clean, modern solution. It shifted the problem from politics to science. If the king was sick, then removing him was an act of mercy, not a coup. In early 1886, Lutz commissioned Dr. Bernhard von Guden to prepare the medical opinion. Guden was the director of the Munich asylum, a man of impeccable reputation. He had treated Ludwig's brother Otto. He was the perfect executioner. But Guden had a problem. He couldn't get near the king. Ludwig refused to see him. So Guden did something that violated every ethical standard of his profession. He agreed to diagnose the patient without examining him. The black agency went to work. They interviewed the king's discarded servants, men who had been fired for incompetence or theft, men who held a grudge. They collected the gossip, the rumors, the moments of anger. Did the king bow to a tree? Yes, write that down. Did the king order a servant to be beheaded? Yes, he said it in a rage. They omitted the fact that he never actually hurt anyone and often gave the servant a gift the next day. Did the king eat with imaginary people? Yes. They compiled a list of symptoms that painted a picture of a raving lunatic. They ignored the fact that Ludwig was still reading complex literature, conducting coherent correspondence on art, and navigating the complex etiquette of the court when he chose to. They stripped him of his context and reduced him to a list of pathologies. By June 1886, the Guden report was finished. It concluded that His Majesty suffered from paranoia chronica, that his mind was completely shattered and that he would never recover. It was a death sentence disguised as a diagnosis. The report was signed by 4 psychiatrists, none of whom had examined him recently. Ludwig, up in his castle, felt the net tightening, but he didn't know the specific shape of the blade. He knew the ministers were plotting, but he thought it was a political struggle. He didn't realize they were questioning his very sanity. He was still trying to borrow money. He was still planning the next wing of Herrenchiem's Sea. He was still the king, believing that his sacred blood would protect him. He was wrong. On June 9, 1886, the government officially proclaimed Prince Luitpold as regent. The king was stripped of his power with a stroke of a pen in a room in Munich, while he sat unaware in his study in Neuschwanstein, listening to the rain against the window. The Commission of State, a group of ministers, doctors, and keepers, boarded a train for the south. They brought with them straitjackets and a carriage with no handles on the inside. They were coming to collect the patient. The sun was setting on the reign of the Swan King. The dream was over. The reality of the asylum was rushing toward him at the speed of a steam train. Ludwig had spent his life building walls to keep the world out, but he had forgotten that walls can also be used to keep a prisoner in. The Night Kingdom was about to be invaded by the harsh clinical light of Dr. Gooden's science. The night of June 9, 1886 was thick with a damp, suffocating fog that clung to the peaks of the Bavarian Alps. Down in the valley, the village of Hohenschwangau was sleeping, but at the train station in nearby Bessenhofen, a train pulled in under the cover of darkness. It carried passengers who had no wish to be seen. This was the State Commission, a group of men sent from Munich with a singular treasonous purpose to capture the King of Bavaria. Among them were Count Hohenstein, the man who had once facilitated Ludwig's secret dealings with Bismarck, but was now his jailer, Baron von Kreilsheim, a minister representing the government, and Dr. Bernhard von Guden, the psychiatrist carrying the piece of paper that declared the king a madman. They brought with them a crew of asylum orderlies, burly men accustomed to wrestling violent patients into submission, and a carriage specially modified with locking doors and no handles on the inside. They moved with the quiet efficiency of assassins, but the conspiracy had a flaw. They had underestimated the loyalty of the common people. As the commission arrived at the station, they were recognized. A loyal coachman named Osterholzer, who had driven the king on many of his midnight sleigh rides, saw the grim-faced men and the asylum attendants. He realized instantly that the rumors were true. They were coming for the king. While the commission was organizing their transport, haggling over horses and trying to maintain their cover, Osterholzer did not hesitate. He jumped into his carriage and whipped his horses into a frenzy. He raced through the dark, winding mountain roads, risking his life on the slippery bends, desperate to reach Neuschwanstein before the government agents. It was a race between the cold bureaucracy of the state and the fierce devotion of a subject. Osterholzer arrived at the castle gates breathless, his horses foaming. He sounded the alarm. "They are coming," he shouted to the castle guards. "They are coming to take the king." The news hit the castle like a lightning strike. For years, Neuschwanstein had been a place of silence and dreams. Now it woke up. The servants, often unpaid and overworked, suddenly remembered that they served a divinely anointed monarch. They barred the massive oak gates. They lit the torches. The king was in his private apartments high in the central tower, unaware that the first act of the siege had begun. When the news was brought to him, Ludwig was bewildered. He couldn't grasp that his own ministers would dare to touch him. He asked with a childlike naivety, "But what do they want?" Around 4 a.m., Under the gray light of a rainy dawn, the commission's carriages rolled up the steep, winding road to the castle gate. They expected a quiet surrender. Dr. Gooden had brought a straitjacket, expecting a raving lunatic. Instead, they found a fortress. The gates were locked. On the battlements, the local gendarmes stood with their rifles loaded. But the most terrifying sight for the sophisticated men from Munich wasn't the police. It was the peasants. The news of the coup had spread to the village below. The woodcutters, the innkeepers, the stable hands, and the washerwomen, the people Ludwig had waved to from his sleigh, the people he had given gold coins to, had rushed up the mountain. They were armed with axes, flails, and heavy sticks. One fierce local woman, armed with nothing but her umbrella and a lifetime of mountain toughness, attacked the commissioners, screaming at them to leave her king alone. Count Hohenstein tried to assert his authority. He waved the document signed by Prince Luitpold, declaring the regency. "Open in the name of the Prince Regent," he demanded. A corporal of the local police, a man named Ignaz Zek, stepped forward. He looked at the aristocrat and spat on the ground. "I know no Prince Regent," he said, leveling his bayonet. "I know only the king." The commissioners were stunned. They were the government, yet they were powerless against this wall of feudal loyalty. The crowd began to surge forward, threatening to drag the ministers out of their carriages and throw them off the cliff. Realizing they were about to be lynched, the commissioners surrendered. In a twist of supreme irony, the men who had come to arrest the king were themselves arrested. The castle guards marched the highest officials of the Bavarian state into the castle courtyard at gunpoint. They were locked in the servants' quarters, fed stale bread and water, and left to contemplate their failure. For a few glorious hours on the morning of June 10th, Ludwig II had won. The coup had failed. The people had risen. The enemies were in the dungeon. Up in the tower, the king was in a state of high agitation. This was his moment. History held its breath. If Ludwig had possessed a shred of the ruthlessness of his ancestors, he could have changed everything. He could have gone out onto the balcony and shown himself to the cheering crowd. He could have ordered the commissioners to be tried for high treason and executed on the spot, a move that would have terrified the government in Munich. He could have taken the carriage and ridden to the telegraph office in Reutte, across the border in Austria, to send a message to the world. Bismarck in Berlin later commented that if Ludwig had ridden into Munich and shown himself to his army, the troops would have sided with him against the ministers. The soldiers would have fired on the parliament, not the king, Bismarck said. But Ludwig was not a man of action. He was a man of aesthetics. The violence, the shouting, the ugly reality of the confrontation repulsed him. He paced his room, wringing his hands. He drank copious amounts of alcohol to steady his nerves. He asked his servants for poison, cyanide, so he could kill himself and escape the humiliation. He didn't want to fight. He wanted to vanish. His aide-de-camp, Count Durkheim, urged him to flee to Munich. "Your Majesty, you must show yourself." But Ludwig paralyzed himself with overthinking. He worried about the aesthetics of a flight. He worried about the noise. He simply couldn't bring himself to step out of the dream and into the brawl. Instead of rallying his forces, Ludwig made a fatal error. He hesitated. And while he hesitated, the machinery of the modern state regrouped. The captured commissioners were released after a few hours, a disastrous act of mercy ordered by the confused king, who couldn't bear the thought of holding gentlemen prisoner. They raced back to Munich to report that the madman was more dangerous than they thought. The government in the capital realized they had to escalate. They couldn't just send a few doctors. They had to send an army. They replaced the loyal local police force with a detachment of Munich police who were loyal to the government. They cut the telegraph lines to the castle, severing Ludwig's voice from the world. They surrounded the mountain. The trap that had snapped open was now being welded shut. On June 11th, the castle fell silent. The loyal peasants had gone home, thinking the danger was over. The loyal police had been relieved of duty. Ludwig was alone in the great stone shell of Neuschwanstein, with only a handful of servants, some of whom had already been bribed by the government. The atmosphere in the castle was funereal. The king sat in the singers' hall under the murals of Parsifal, waiting for the end. He knew they would come back. He asked his valet, Mayor, "Do you think they will put me in a cage on the Marienplatz like a wild animal?" The second commission arrived in the dead of night, at midnight on June 12th. This time there was no dramatic confrontation at the gate. Dr. Gudden had learned his lesson. They didn't announce themselves. They had a key. A traitorous servant opened a side door near the kitchen. The alienists and the orderlies slipped into the castle like ghosts. They moved silently up the winding stone staircases, their footsteps muffled by the carpets. Ludwig was in his bedroom, the room designed to look like the bower of Tristan and Isolde, with its dark blue ceiling covered in golden stars. He was pacing. Suddenly, the door opened. There was no announcement. Dr. Gudden walked in, followed by the burly orderlies. The king stopped. He stood by the window, a towering, ruinous figure, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and imperious fury. Dr. Gudden stepped forward, calm and clinical. He didn't bow. He spoke to the king as one speaks to a child. "Majesty," he said, "I have the painful duty to inform you that the Prince Regent has assumed the government." Ludwig looked at the man who was destroying him. He asked the question that still echoes through history, a question of piercing sanity. "How can you declare me insane? You have not examined me." Gudden replied with the arrogance of a man who believes science trumps truth. "Majesty, it is not necessary. The documentary evidence is overwhelming." It was the triumph of the dossier over the human being. Ludwig looked at the orderlies, who were holding the straitjacket, though they didn't use it. He saw the futility of resistance. He slumped. "What do you want me to do?" "You must accompany us to Berg Castle," Gudden said. The departure from Neuschwanstein was a scene of Gothic heartbreak. It was 4 a.m. The rain was pouring down, a relentless weeping deluge. A carriage waited in the courtyard, the special carriage with the locking doors. As Ludwig walked down the spiral staircase of the tower for the last time, he paused. He looked at the unfinished walls, the murals of the knights, the world he had built to protect himself. He was leaving his sanctuary to go to his prison. He turned to a servant, Mayor, and said quietly, "Preserve these rooms as a sanctuary. Do not let the curious stare at them." He knew, with a prophet's certainty, that his private dream was about to become a public spectacle. He stepped out into the courtyard. The servant Meyer, weeping, kissed his hand. Ludwig looked at the carriage, then at Dr. Gudden. "I am ready," he said. He climbed inside. Gudden climbed in beside him. The door was locked from the outside. The horses pulled away, their hooves clattering on the cobblestones. The carriage descended the mountain road, disappearing into the mist and the rain. Neuschwanstein, the stone dream, was left behind, empty and silent, a headstone for a living man. The journey to Berg Castle took several hours. Ludwig sat in silence, staring out at the gray, rain-soaked landscape of his lost kingdom. He asked for a glass of water at a station stop, and the peasants who saw him peered through the windows, shocked to see their king looking so old, so defeated. They took off their hats, but the police pushed them back. The king was no longer a monarch. He was patient number 1. They arrived at Berg Castle in the afternoon of June 12th. The castle, a small summer residence on the shores of Lake Starnberg, had been transformed. It was no longer a royal home. It was a high-security ward. The doors had peepholes drilled into them so the doctors could watch the king at all times. The windows were fitted with iron bars. The handles were removed. Ludwig was shown to his room. He looked at the peephole in the door and turned to Gudrun. "Is this how you treat your king?" he asked. Gudrun did not answer. That evening the king seemed to accept his fate. He ate a good dinner. He spoke politely to the doctors. He went to bed early. To Gudrun, this compliance was a sign that the treatment was working, that the king was accepting his new reality as an invalid. Gudrun wrote to the government in Munich, "Everything is proceeding excellently." He was proud of his bloodless coup. He thought he had tamed the tiger. He did not realize that he was locked in a cage with a man who had nothing left to lose, a man who had spent his entire life planning dramatic exits. The stage was set for the final scene, and the lake was waiting, dark and deep, just outside the window. Sunday, June the 13th, 1886. The day broke over Lake Starnberg with a heaviness that felt almost physical. It was Pentecost Sunday, the Feast of the Holy Spirit, a day of celebration in the Catholic calendar. But at Berg Castle, the atmosphere was one of suffocating tension, masked by a polite, bureaucratic calm. The castle, a neo-Gothic manor that Ludwig had once loved as a summer retreat, had been effectively transformed into a high-end prison. The windows were secured, the doors were drilled with peepholes, and the grounds were patrolled by policemen and asylum orderlies. Inside, the staff moved in hushed silence, their eyes constantly flicking toward the door of the king's suite. They were witnessing the dismantling of a monarch, the reduction of a semi-divine figure into a medical case study. Ludwig rose early. To the doctors watching him through the spy holes, he appeared surprisingly, almost unnervingly, composed. The hysterical agitation of the previous days, the threats of suicide, the demands for poison, the desperate pacing in the tower of Neuschwanstein seemed to have evaporated. In its place was a quiet, regal resignation. Dr. Bernhard von Gudrun, the architect of this imprisonment, was delighted. He telegraphed the Prime Minister in Munich, "Everything going well. Patient is quiet and compliant." Gudrun, a man of supreme arrogance in his own diagnostic powers, believed he had already broken the king's will. He saw the calm not as the quiet before a storm, but as the submission of a patient to his doctor's authority. It was a fatal miscalculation. He saw a madman accepting treatment. He should have seen a chess player planning his final move. The king attended Mass in the castle chapel that morning. He sat in his private box, visible to the staff. He followed the liturgy with apparent devotion, but his eyes were often fixed on the window, looking out at the gray, churning waters of the lake. What was he thinking? Was he praying for deliverance? Was he repenting for his sins? Or was he measuring the distance to the water? After Mass, he ate a hearty breakfast. He conversed with the orderlies, asking them about their families, their wages, the local gossip. He was charming, lucid, and utterly rational. This behavior confused the lower-ranking staff. They had been told they were guarding a raving lunatic, a danger to himself and others. Instead, they found a gentle, sad giant who treated them with more courtesy than the doctors did. At around 11 a.m., Dr. Gudrun suggested a walk. It was standard asylum practice, fresh air and mild exercise to soothe the nerves. Ludwig agreed. They walked through the castle park, accompanied by several burly orderlies following close behind. The king seemed relaxed. He pointed out different trees, discussing their botanical names. He talked about the architecture of the castle. Gudrun was relieved. He felt his diagnosis was being vindicated. The king was indeed manageable. They returned to the castle for lunch without incident. Ludwig ate voraciously. consuming several courses. He drank his wine. He even made a joke. The tension in the castle began to dissipate. The guards relaxed their grip on their rifles. The orderlies loosened their collars. The monster was just a tired man after all. The afternoon dragged on. The weather, which had been threatening all day, began to turn. The wind picked up, whipping the surface of the lake into whitecaps. Dark clouds rolled in from the Alps, blotting out the sun. Inside his room, Ludwig requested a glass of water. He stood by the window looking out at the park. He asked the orderly, "Mater, what time is the sunset?" Mater replied that it would be around 8 o'clock, but with the storm coming, it would likely be dark sooner. Ludwig nodded slowly. "The water looks inviting," he murmured almost to himself. The orderly didn't report the comment. It seemed innocuous enough. At 4 p.m., Dr. Gooden sat down to write another report to the ministry. He described the king's excellent behavior. He wrote that the king was talkative and showed no signs of aggression. Based on this progress, Gooden made a decision that would cost him his life. When the king requested another walk for the evening, Gooden agreed, but this time he decided to change the protocol. Perhaps he wanted to build trust with his patient. Perhaps he wanted to show the king that he was not a jailer, but a friend. Or perhaps it was pure hubris, the belief that he, the great man of science, could control the king with the force of his personality alone. At 6:10 p.m., the king emerged from his room. He was wearing a heavy loden coat against the chill and a wide-brimmed felt hat. He carried an umbrella. Dr. Gooden met him in the hallway. The doctor turned to the orderlies who were preparing to follow them. "No," Gooden said, raising his hand. "The king and I will go alone. You may stay behind." The head orderly looked at the doctor with concern. "Herr Doctor," he hesitated, "is that wise?" "It is an order," Gooden snapped. "Stay here." It was a staggering breach of security. To take a patient diagnosed with advanced paranoia and suicidal tendencies out into an unfenced park near deep water in a storm with no guards was inconceivable. Why did Gooden do it? Did Ludwig manipulate him? Had the king promised to tell him a secret, something he could only say in private? We will never know. The heavy oak doors of the castle swung open. Ludwig II and Dr. Bernhard von Gooden stepped out into the gathering gloom. They walked down the gravel path toward the lake. The last person to see them alive was a castle sentry. He reported seeing the two men walking side by side. The king, tall and imposing, was walking briskly. The doctor, much shorter and older, was hurrying to keep up. They were talking. They turned a corner near a clump of rhododendrons and vanished from sight. The plan was for a short stroll. They were expected back for supper at 8 p.m. The clocks in the castle ticked away the minutes. 6:30, 7. The rain began to fall, first a drizzle, then a steady, cold downpour. The wind howled through the trees. Inside the castle, the table was set for dinner. The soup was warming. The servants waited. 8 p.m. The door did not open. Dr. Müller, Gooden's assistant, looked at his watch. He felt a prickle of unease. Gooden was a man of precise habits. He was never late for meals. Müller went to the window. It was nearly dark outside. He could see nothing but the rain streaking the glass. He waited another 10 minutes. Then 20, 8:30 p.m. The unease turned to anxiety. Müller called for the orderlies. "They should have been back," he said. "Take lanterns, go into the park, find them." The men grabbed storm lanterns and rushed out into the night. They shouted, "Herr Doctor, Majesty!" Their voices were swallowed by the wind. They ran down the paths, the beams of their lanterns cutting through the driving rain. They checked the benches where the king liked to sit. Empty. They checked the Venus temple on the hill. Empty. 9 p.m. Panic. Genuine cold panic. The entire castle was awake. The police were roused from the barracks. "The king is missing!" The cry went up. Had he escaped? Was there a carriage waiting? Were armed loyalists hiding in the woods? The fear of a counter-coup gripped the officials. They imagined the king riding to Munich at the head of a rebel army. They expanded the search perimeter. Then, a shout from the lakeshore. Here, over here. An orderly had found something. On a park bench near the water's edge lay 2 umbrellas. One belonged to the king, the other to the doctor. But there was no sign of the men. The searchers moved closer to the water. The ground near the shore was churned up. The wet mud showed signs of a violent disturbance. Footprints sliding, deep gouges in the earth as if heavy bodies had twisted and turned. A few yards away, floating in the shallows, they found the king's hat, then the doctor's hat, then the king's jacket. Dr. Miller ran to the boathouse. He grabbed a boat and rowed out onto the dark, choppy water, his lantern swaying from the bow. He peered into the black depths. The rain lashed his face. He rowed back and forth, dread coiling in his stomach. At 10:30 p.m., the lantern light caught something floating in the water, about 20 paces from the shore. It was a dark shape, bobbing in the waves. Müller rowed closer. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was a body. It was face down, the coat billowing out around it like a dark shroud. It was the king. And a few feet away, another body. Dr. Gooden. Müller screamed for help. The men on the shore waded into the icy water. They dragged the heavy, lifeless bodies onto the mud. They laid them out on the grass, the rain washing over the pale faces. King Ludwig II was dead. The man who had built fairy tale castles, who had bankrupted a state for art, who had tried to hide from the world, lay in the mud, his eyes open, staring at the dark sky. His watch had stopped at 6:54 p.m. He was 40 years old. Dr. Gooden was dead beside him. His face was a mask of violence. There was a bruise on his right eye. There were scratches on his nose. His neck showed red marks as if he had been throttled. The top button of his coat was torn off. The king, however, looked peaceful. There were no wounds on his face, no bruises. He looked like a man who had simply gone to sleep. Dr. Müller knelt beside the king. He tried artificial respiration. He pumped the king's chest. He blew air into his lungs. For an hour under the pouring rain, they tried to bring the monarch back to life. But there was no pulse, no breath. The Swan King had flown. The news was telegraphed to Munich at midnight. King Ludwig II is dead. The message hit the capital like a bomb. The regent, Prince Leopold, was woken from his sleep. The ministers were summoned. The church bells began to toll, a slow, mournful sound rolling across the sleeping city. But back on the shore of Lake Starnberg, as the bodies were loaded onto a cart to be taken back to the castle, the mystery was already taking root. The official narrative was being constructed even before the mud was wiped from the king's face. Suicide. It had to be suicide. The mad king had killed his doctor and then himself. It was the only explanation that saved the government. It wrapped the tragedy in a bow of inevitability. But the men who pulled the bodies from the water whispered among themselves. They had seen the lack of water coming from the king's mouth. They had seen the marks on Gooden. They had seen the strange footprints in the mud. They knew that a suicide didn't explain the struggle. They knew that a man bent on drowning himself doesn't stop to strangle his doctor unless the doctor is trying to stop him, or unless the doctor is trying to kill him. As the cart rattled back up the hill to the castle, carrying the wet, dead weight of the last true king of the 19th century, the silence of the lake seemed to deepen. The water had taken its prize. The king, who had loved the night, had finally become part of it. The fairy tale was over. The ghost story had begun. The dawn that followed the night of June 13th rose over a kingdom that had fundamentally changed. The body of the king lay in a makeshift morgue within Berg Castle. guarded by the very men who had failed to keep him alive. But even in death, Ludwig II was not allowed the dignity of silence. The machinery of the state, terrified of the vacuum created by his demise, immediately shifted into high gear to control the narrative. Before the sun was fully up, the telegrams flying back to Munich were crafting the official story. The mad king, in a final paroxysm of insanity, had murdered his doctor and then committed suicide. It was a neat, tragic package that exonerated the government of negligence and justified the deposition. If the king was violent enough to kill, then locking him up had been the right thing to do. But the autopsy, performed on June 15th in the Munich residence, was a macabre theater of confirmation bias. A team of 13 doctors, led by the replacement asylum director, stood over the bloated corpse of the Swan King. They weren't looking for the cause of death. That was assumed to be drowning. They were looking for the justification of their diagnosis. They sawed open the skull to examine the royal brain. They noted that the brain was shrunken and showed signs of degeneration. They claimed this was irrefutable physical proof of his insanity. Modern neurology tells us that these findings were likely normal variations, or the result of the crude science of the time. But in 1886, it was the final stamp of authority. The king was mad. The file was closed. Yet there was one detail in the autopsy report that the government tried to bury, a detail that has fueled conspiracy theories for over a century. When the doctors examined the lungs, they found them remarkably dry. In a typical drowning, the lungs are filled with water as the victim gasps for air. Ludwig's lungs were not. This led to the theory of dry drowning, a sudden spasm of the larynx caused by the shock of cold water, or a massive heart attack. But for the loyalists, for the peasants who whispered in the beer halls, it pointed to something darker. It suggested that the king might have been dead before he hit the water, or that he was murdered on the shore and dragged in. The whispers grew louder when the body was put on public display. Thousands of Bavarians filed past the open coffin in the royal chapel. They saw a king who looked peaceful, but they also heard the rumors from the washerwomen who had cleaned the king's coat. Stories circulated of bullet holes in the royal jacket that had been hastily sewn up or covered. Some claimed to have seen smoke rising from the bushes near the lake that night. The escape theory took root, that loyal conspirators had a boat waiting to ferry Ludwig across the lake to safety, that Dr. Guden had caught him in the act of fleeing, and that a government agent hiding in the shadows had shot the king to prevent his escape. It makes sense in the cold calculus of power. A living, exiled Ludwig would have been a constant threat to the new regent, a rallying point for every disgruntled monarchist in Europe. A dead martyr was safer. Whatever the truth, the funeral on June 19th was the greatest spectacle Munich had ever seen. It was a thunderstorm of grief. As the hearse, drawn by 8 black horses, moved through the streets, the skies opened up, and a violent tempest lashed the city, as if nature itself was mourning the storm king. Lightning struck the church of St. Michael, where the body was to be interred. The people wept openly. They didn't care about the debts or the strangeness. They felt instinctively that with Ludwig's death, the soul of Bavaria, the romantic, poetic, distinct spirit of the South, had died too, replaced by the gray efficiency of Prussia. The tragedy of the House of Wittelsbach did not end at Ludwig's grave. Rather, it stretched out like a long, bleak twilight. The crown passed to his younger brother, Otto, but his was a reign of ghosts. For 30 years, the new king lived in the darkness of his madness at Fürstenried Palace, utterly unaware that he was ruling. Real power fell to the Prince Regent Luitpold, who transformed Bavaria into a machine of stability and pragmatism. erasing the old romantic dreams of the South. Yet history delivered a stinging slap of irony to those who had once criticized Ludwig. Only 6 weeks after his death, the very government that had screamed about his extravagance rushed to open Neuschwanstein to the paying public. The castle, once condemned as a massive liability and intended as a hermit's private sanctuary, became an eternal money-making machine, transforming the madman's follies into Bavaria's most precious asset. Walt Disney and millions of travelers have since found inspiration in the vision of the man deemed insane, proving that beauty possesses a vitality far more enduring than any political calculation. When the storm of revolution swept through in 1918, the Wittelsbach dynasty collapsed after more than 7 centuries, ending in the ignoble flight of its last rulers. But while the names of the astute politicians and generals who once manipulated the chessboard have faded into the dust of time, Ludwig II achieved the immortality he craved. He won the long game of history, not with gunpowder or treaties, but with the sheer power of imagination. The world may have forgotten the victors of the wars of his era, but it will forever remember the solitary Moon King who rejected the gray reality of the industrial age to build paradises of stone on earth. Ultimately, the life and death of Ludwig II leave posterity with a poignant reminder of the value of dreams in a world that often places too much value on utility. He was a failed king in the political arena, but a magnificent figure in the art of living. To this day, the simple cross standing in the cold waters of Lake Starnberg guards the secret of that fateful night, fulfilling the king's wish to remain an eternal enigma. As the sun sets over the Alps, casting purple shadows across the peaks, one can almost sense his sleigh gliding through the night, carrying the king away from the cruel world of men and back into the eternal kingdom of legend, the only realm where he can never be deposed.